helmet, from leather to lifeline. Every era of football can be traced through the helmet, from the soft leather relics of survival to the polymer fortresses of today. It's more than gear. It's the physical record of how far the game has gone and how much it's taken to get there. In the 1920s, the helmet wasn't protection. It was decoration. A stitched leather cap that looked more like a pilot's headgear than a barrier against death. Some players didn't even wear one. They believed a helmet made you weak. Back then, toughness was measured in scars. If you bled, you belonged. And on those dirt fields, men hit like they were still proving they were alive. By the 1930s, as injuries piled up, equipment makers began to experiment with molded leather and hardened ear flaps. It wasn't safety science, it was damage control. Football was brutal, but it was growing. And with every new fan came another reason to keep players standing. In the 1940s, plastic arrived. It was revolutionary, the first real attempt to make the helmet something more than a costume. But plastic changed everything. Players felt invincible. They threw their bodies harder, led with their heads, and collided like battering rams. It was the birth of the spearing era, when helmets stopped being shields and became weapons. By the 1960s, the face mask became standard. It protected teeth and noses, but also erased faces. You couldn't see pain anymore. The helmet turned men into anonymous soldiers, uniform, silent, replaceable. It made the game easier to love and the players easier to forget. Then came the 1980s, the age of TV, slow motion, and highlight violence. Helmets weren't just protection now. They were branding. Logos gleamed under stadium lights. Impact sounds were amplified, and fans loved it. Every collision echoed through living rooms across America. Football had finally mastered its look and buried the cost beneath the spectacle. It took decades for the truth to surface. Concussions weren't temporary. They were cumulative. The brain doesn't bruise and heal. It degenerates, and by the time the league admitted it, entire generations of players were already living with the damage. Confused, angry, broken, and alone. Now, in the modern era, the helmet is a computer. Carbon fiber shells, gel padding, impact sensors that record data in real time. Every hit measured, every risk cataloged, and yet nothing fundamental has changed. We can record trauma now, we just can't stop it. The human brain was never designed for 60 collisions a game. The helmet's evolution mirrors the league's philosophy. Solve the problem just enough to keep the game alive. Not too safe to lose its edge. Not too dangerous to shut it down. A perfect balance between progress and denial. The helmet started as courage. It became confidence. And finally, it became confession. Proof that the game has always known what it does to the men who play it. But protecting the head meant nothing if the body was still breaking beneath it. The pads, from armor to illusion. Football was never meant to be safe, but it learned to look safe. And nothing captures that illusion more clearly than the pads. What started as scraps of cloth sewn under jerseys became armor, heavy, hard, and theatrical. But every time the padding improved, so did the collisions. Protection didn't slow the game down, it sped it up. In the 1920s and 30s, padding was barely there. Felt, wool, or horsehair stitched into vests. It absorbed sweat more than impact. Players wrapped rags around shoulders or ribs and called it enough. Tackling was clumsy and desperate, more grappling than striking. The violence was constant, but it was human. Every hit hurt, and that pain set a limit. You couldn't hit harder than your body allowed. That limit disappeared in the 1950s. Manufacturers introduced foam cores, plastic shells, and steel rivets. The new pads were marvels, light enough to move, strong enough to hit without fear. Suddenly, players could explode into each other without hesitation. And when fear left the field, physics took over. Mass, speed, momentum multiplied. What followed wasn't progress. It was acceleration. By the 1970s, shoulder pads had grown massive, thick fiberglass plates designed to make men look bigger, meaner, unstoppable. They created a new kind of player, the human missile. Linebackers led with their shoulders like wrecking balls. Running backs dropped their heads and became weapons themselves. And every collision sounded like a gunshot. It wasn't football anymore. It was impact theater. But evolution never stops. By the 1990s, the NFL wanted speed. The pads got smaller, sleeker, lighter, designed to optimize movement, not protection. They looked futuristic. They weren't. Every ounce saved meant less cushioning, less safety, more precision violence. The equipment had completed its transformation. from defense to deception. Modern gear is built from aerospace polymers, carbon reinforcements, and shock diffusion technology. It's advanced enough to protect soldiers, engineered to survive car crashes. Yet players still walk away concussed, limping, broken, because pads can't stop force. They only spread it. They don't reduce violence. They disguise it. Every advancement in protection has served the same purpose, to keep the game brutal without letting it look that way. The armor didn't civilize football. It let football evolve into something even more dangerous. The pads were supposed to save players. Instead, they saved the sport. But as the armor grew stronger, the rules had to evolve to contain it. The rules. Order in the chaos. The NFL didn't begin with rules. It began with violence. 11 men per side, a muddy field, and one guiding principle: survive the next hit. There were no boundaries for brutality, only the unspoken code that if you could still move, you kept playing. In the 1920s, that chaos nearly killed the sport. There were no forward passes, no defined neutral zone. Punches, eye gouges, and late hits were considered effort. Referees existed, but authority didn't. Injuries were part of the ticket price. Players bleeding on the field while crowds cheered the wreckage. But as the league tried to grow, that blood started to stain its image. Teams were folding. Parents were pulling kids out of football. The sport needed order, or it wouldn't survive. The 1930s began the era of structure. For the first time, the NFL wrote its own rulebook, not borrowed from college football, but built to define itself. They legalized passing from anywhere behind the line of scrimmage, creating the first modern offensive system. They moved the goalposts, added hash marks, and introduced the championship game. The chaos hadn't disappeared, but now it had a shape. Football had found its framework: danger, contained by design. The 1940s refined that order out of necessity. World War II stripped rosters bare, forcing innovation. Coaches like George Halas and Clark Shaughnessy weaponized the new T formation, a system that gave quarterbacks command. That change created football's first real strategy, and its first real vulnerability. When a quarterback could pass, the league had to start protecting him. The 1950s brought face masks, substitution rules, and forward progress whistles. Penalties were introduced for late hits and unnecessary roughness. But even as the game tried to civilize itself, it was doing so for the wrong reason. Not because players were dying, but because TV was watching. For the first time, football was in America's living rooms. And on television, chaos needed choreography. The 1960s and 70s pushed those boundaries again. The AFL's fast-paced, high-scoring style forced the NFL to evolve or get left behind. When the leagues merged in 1970, the result was parity and a new kind of brutality. Defenses became weapons. The Steel Curtain and Legion of Doom thrived in an era when helmet-to-helmet hits were legal, celebrated, and replayed in slow motion. So when Mel Blount's violent coverage nearly erased entire passing games, the league created the 1978 5-yard contact rule. Receivers got space, and offenses exploded. Every rule came with a trade-off. Safety never won. Scoring did. In the 1980s and 90s, quarterbacks became investments, so the league wrapped them in legal armor. Roughing the passer became an art form of interpretation. Hits below the knees, leading with the crown. Unnecessary roughness, all flagged to protect the face of the franchise. But what started as safety policy became brand management. The NFL wasn't preserving players. It was preserving profits. The 2000s forced the first real reckoning. High-profile deaths, Mike Webster, Junior Seau, Dave Duerson, exposed the long-term cost of the violence the rules had never really stopped. Suddenly, the concussion protocol existed. Targeting was outlawed. Helmet-to-helmet contact became a penalty, but even that came with contradiction. Every week, networks aired segments titled Biggest Hits. The rules had evolved, but the appetite for danger hadn't. Now the game is a maze of regulation. Forward progress, defenseless receivers, roughing the passer replays slowed to milliseconds. Officials dissect intent. Fans argue about physics. The game looks clean, but every flag is still written in fear. Because no rule can truly control football. It can only redirect it. Players adapt, coaches exploit, and violence always finds its way back through the loopholes. The rulebook isn't a shield, it's a diary. A record of every injury, every scandal, every moment when someone got hurt badly enough to force change. Football didn't grow civilized through rules. It learned how to make brutality sustainable. A game that began lawless learned to hide its savagery behind structure. And every new law came with its next inevitable rebellion. Because once the boundaries were drawn, the minds began to test them. The sideline, the rise of coaching. Every rule creates a limit, and every limit invites a mind to break it. That's where the coaches came in, the architects of football's next evolution. They were the first to understand that the rule book wasn't a barrier, it was a blueprint. In the early days, coaching barely existed. Teams were led by captains, not tacticians. Plays were drawn in the dirt, and most strategies were built on instinct and chaos. Winning came down to who could endure more punishment, not who could outthink the other side. But as the league found order, the sideline became its laboratory. George Halas was one of the first to see football as engineering. He studied formations like a general studies terrain, every yard a calculation, every down a chance to control time. In the 1940s, Halas and Clark Shaughnessy revolutionized offense with the T formation, shifting the quarterback behind center and turning football into a game of leverage and deception. It was the birth of modern coaching, when violence began to obey intelligence. Then came the men who gave the game identity. Paul Brown built systems where discipline ruled over chaos. He invented the playbook, created film study, and turned practice into science. He was the first to put radios in helmets, decades before anyone thought of the word communication device. For the first time, players didn't just react, they executed. Football wasn't about improvisation anymore. It was about precision. Vince Lombardi followed with something more human, control through belief. His Green Bay Packers weren't just organized, they were indoctrinated. Lombardi preached execution as religion. Perfection is not attainable, but if we chase perfection, we can catch excellence. His teams didn't outmuscle opponents, they outdisciplined them. He turned football into ritual, cold, exact, unbreakable. The league crowned him the ideal, and every coach after tried to become his reflection. By the 1970s and 80s, coaching evolved again, from leadership to innovation. Bill Walsh took Lombardi's order and rewired it into creativity. His West Coast offense transformed space into strategy. Short passes as extensions of the run game, rhythm as violence disguised as art. He used motion, timing, and misdirection to dismantle defenses built for chaos. Every play became a chess move, not a collision, and for a moment, it seemed the game had matured. But then came the counterpunch, the rise of defensive architects. Bill Parcells, Buddy Ryan, Tom Landry. They studied offense like a language to be broken. Parcells used psychology as much as scheme. Ryan turned defense into theater with his 46 formation, and Landry built machines in silver helmets who obeyed like computers. Every innovation brought its opposition. Every genius invited an equal. That's how the NFL grew, through conflict not just on the field, but on the sideline. The 1990s and 2000s made coaching global. Analytics entered the conversation. Game plans became scripts of probability. Bill Belichick perfected the art of subtraction, removing weaknesses until only inevitability remained. He studied film the way surgeons study anatomy, finding where teams bled and cutting deeper. No coach ever made dominance look so methodical. He didn't build dynasties out of stars, he built them out of control. And now, in the modern era, coaching has become something else entirely. A hybrid of mathematician, psychologist, and CEO Sean McVay, and Kyle Shanahan carry tablets instead of playbooks. Coaches no longer just call plays. They curate algorithms. Games are decided by analytics models that measure risk down to decimal points. But even as the science advanced, the truth never changed. Coaching is still about manipulation. Of the field, of time, of men. Every era produced its genius, and every genius found new ways to weaponize structure. That's what coaching became. Not the mind that tamed football, but the mind that taught it how to evolve without ever losing its brutality. They mastered the system, but in doing so, they created something more dangerous. A game that thought for itself. And once the coaches turned the game into design, the playbook became the weapon. The playbook. Strategy becomes science. The playbook began as a handful of sketches drawn in dirt. A few arrows, a circle for the ball, and a prayer that someone would be standing upright at the end of the play. Today, it's a coded language, thick as a novel, encrypted by jargon only insiders can read. The evolution of the playbook is the story of how football's violence was refined into precision. In the earliest days, there were no playbooks, just habits. Teams lined up, ran straight ahead, and waited for someone to break first. Games were decided by endurance, not intellect. The first real strategies came from necessity. Shifts to disguise direction, laterals to confuse defenders, and the forward pass, once seen as cowardice, eventually redefined the entire sport. By the 1940s, plays became blueprints. Coaches began diagramming routes, plotting timing, studying tendencies. The huddle was born, the first battlefield conference. It was where violence learned to wait for permission. In the 1950s, Paul Brown institutionalized the playbook. He turned plays into commandments, demanding precision down to the footstep. Each position had an assignment, each movement a purpose. The chaos of 11 men became choreography. For the first time, Football resembled design more than disorder. The 1960s and 70s transformed that design into a weapon. Sid Gilman imagined football in vertical space, long, stretching routes that forced defenses to guard the air. His ideas birthed the modern passing game and influenced everyone who followed. Don Coryell built on it in San Diego, perfecting the art of offensive explosion. And on the other side, defensive minds responded with new languages of resistance. Zone blitzes, disguises, pressure packages. The counter-revolution began. Every new idea forced another to evolve. The 1980s belonged to architects. Bill Walsh and Joe Montana turned offense into rhythm. The West Coast system replaced brute force with calculation. 5-yard passes that controlled the clock better than a power run ever could. The playbook became philosophy. Control the pace, control the game. Each snap was a conversation between order and chaos, and the coach's handwriting became the sport's DNA. By the 1990s and 2000s, the playbook exploded. Shotgun formations, spread concepts, option reads, teams borrowed from college systems, adapted from other sports, and mixed them into a single, unstoppable hybrid. Defenses learned to disguise everything, showing blitz, dropping coverage, bluffing speed. The playbook was no longer a binder. It was a chess match written in code. Then came the data age. Tablets replaced paper. Algorithms replaced instinct. Game plans were now simulations. Thousands of scenarios tested before kickoff. Plays weren't called by gut anymore. They were calculated by probability. Fourth and short wasn't about courage. It was about math. The playbook had become science. Football, the sport of blood and mud, had turned into an experiment in optimization. Yet for all its complexity, every page in that book still serves one ancient purpose: to create space and inflict pain within it. No algorithm can erase that. Every arrow still ends in contact. Every design still collides with human flesh. The playbook evolved from survival to sophistication, from guesswork to geometry. It turned aggression into art. But the art never replaced the violence. It only disguised it behind diagrams. And for all the evolution of strategy, none of it matters without the men who execute it, the bodies that carry the weight of every line ever drawn. Because the playbook may design the battle, but it's the player who pays for it. The player, the human machine. The first NFL players weren't athletes. They were laborers, miners, farmers, mechanics, men who worked 6 days a week and hit people on Sunday for gas money. They didn't train. They endured. They played both ways, taped broken fingers to keep them straight, and used toughness as a job requirement. Football wasn't performance then. It was punishment. But as the league grew, so did its appetite for specialization. By the 1950s, the Iron Man era was over. Offense and defense split into separate worlds. Linemen grew heavier, backs grew faster. The game that once celebrated endurance began rewarding extremes. Every generation since has produced a new model. Bigger, stronger, faster, more efficient. The human body became the NFL's most refined technology. In the 1970s and 80s, the player entered the industrial age. Training camps became factories, diets became blueprints, and the offseason stopped existing. Weight rooms turned into laboratories. Players became walking machines of precision running backs built like sprinters, linebackers sculpted like tanks. The margin for error shrank with every rep. The body was now a product of science, but it came with a cost. Science didn't care about recovery. Performance drugs found their way into the locker room. Painkillers became a way of life. In the pursuit of dominance, the body's natural limits were rewritten, and men began breaking down younger than ever before. They didn't retire. They collapsed. By the 1990s, the league had mastered the system. Combined numbers became currency. A tenth of a second could make or end a career. Draft boards became laboratories of measurement. 40 times, vertical jumps, bench presses. Data over instinct. The players became assets. The scouting report replaced the handshake. In the 2000s, nutrition and technology created the modern prototype. Year-round athletes monitored by GPS trackers and heart rate metrics. Their workloads planned by analytics. Their diets engineered by performance teams. Bodies optimized to perform like machines, even if they still broke like men. Every pound of muscle added power. Every ounce of fatigue added risk. And the game asked for more. Always more. The modern NFL player is a contradiction. They are the most protected, yet the most exposed. They know more about their health than any generation before, and yet the pressure to sacrifice that health is stronger than ever. They play through pain, not because they have to, but because they're expected to. Next man up isn't a slogan. It's an obituary. The player evolved from warrior to weapon, from individual to instrument. Every collision, every injury, every test of will is part of an endless cycle of replacement. And when a career ends, another body is waiting to take the same risk, built the same way, for the same machine. The league calls it progress. The players call it opportunity. But underneath the glory and precision lies the same truth that built the sport a century ago. Football doesn't care what breaks, as long as something keeps moving. The player has become the game's greatest invention. and its most disposable part. The bodies evolved, and so did the world watching them. The culture, from brotherhood to brand. Before the fame, before the money, football was family. Locker rooms were held together by tape, sweat, and loyalty. Players didn't sign endorsement deals. They signed one another's stitches shut. Every touchdown, every bruise, every victory belonged to the group. The sport's soul was brotherhood, forged in pain, built on trust. That started to change the moment the cameras moved closer. In the 1950s, television turned football into America's Sunday ritual. What was once local became national, and what was once brutal became beautiful. Slow motion made violence poetic. Mud and blood looked heroic in black and white. For the first time, fans didn't just watch football, they worshipped it. By the 1970s, the NFL understood its new power. Teams became identities, dynasties became brands. The Cowboys were America's team, the Steelers were blue-collar warriors, and the Raiders were villains dressed in black, selling rebellion, not plays. Football became theater. Every helmet was a symbol. Every hit was a commercial for toughness. The players changed with it. Endorsements replaced off-season jobs. Media training replaced silence. Locker rooms became content studios. And the game that once represented unity began dividing into personas. Quarterbacks became CEOs. Receivers became entertainers. Defenses became slogans. And the NFL leaned in, because image sold better than honesty. The 1990s made football global. Satellite TV, Nike commercials, and highlight culture turned players into icons. Michael Irvin wasn't just a wide receiver, he was a brand ambassador for confidence. Deion Sanders turned swagger into currency. And the league realized something crucial. Violence was the hook, but personality was the product. By the 2000s, football wasn't just America's game. It was America's reflection. Glitz, excess, dominance, denial. The Super Bowl stopped being a championship and became a spectacle. Halftime shows drew more viewers than entire playoff games. Sponsors fought for airtime, players for exposure, and the bond that once held teams together began to fracture under ego and economics. Today, football exists in two realities. On the field, a brotherhood still held together by shared suffering. Off it, a billion-dollar marketplace of identity. Social media turned athletes into brands within brands. Followers became as valuable as fans. And the league, always aware, built entire narratives around its stars. The comeback story, the villain arc, the redemption tour. Everything packaged, everything monetized. But behind the marketing, the truth still breathes. In locker rooms, men still tape ankles for teammates, still play through pain for each other, still cry when the season ends. Not for contracts, but for connection. Because the human part of the game never really left. It just got buried beneath the lights. Football's culture evolved from brotherhood to brand, from shared suffering to spectacle. The league sold the violence, then sold the story that justified it. And through all of it, the players kept showing up, because love for the game, that unbreakable, irrational loyalty, was the only thing that money couldn't manufacture. The sport became an empire, the players became products, and somewhere between the two, the audience became addicted. But behind every sold-out stadium and billion-dollar broadcast was a cost no sponsor could cover. Because as the spectacle grew, so did the aftermath. The aftermath, the human cost. Progress always has a price. Football's is measured in bodies and memories. For every trophy raised, 100 surgeries followed. For every Sunday roar, there's a silence that comes years later. A man sitting in the dark, trying to remember the game that made him. The modern NFL stands on the shoulders of men who can no longer stand straight. Their stories are scattered across decades. Linemen who can't climb stairs, linebackers who forget their children's names, legends who took their own lives when the pain finally outlasted the cheers. The league calls it evolution. But to the players who built it, it feels more like erosion. In the early years, the damage was visible. Broken bones, split skin, missing teeth. You could see it, patch it, play through it. But the real injuries were invisible. The ones that hid behind helmets and face masks. CTE, dementia, depression. The silent trophies of toughness. They didn't appear until decades later, when the body stopped lying and the brain started to fade. For years, the NFL denied it. Doctors were ignored, lawsuits delayed, truth buried under sponsorships and slogans. Safety reforms came, but only after funerals. Concussion protocols, independent doctors, sideline checks, all progress written in obituaries. Every rule that protects players today exists because someone didn't survive yesterday. And yet, the game endures. Because despite everything, it still commands devotion. Men still line up for it. Parents still let their children dream of it. Fans still live by it. It remains the closest thing America has to modern mythology. Heroes built from violence, stories written in collisions. The helmets evolved. The pads evolved. The rules, the coaching, the playbooks, the players, the culture. all evolved. But the heart of the game never changed. It's still a battle disguised as entertainment, a collision between progress and pain. The league calls it safer, and maybe, by the numbers, it is. But it's also smarter, faster, stronger, and that makes every impact sharper than before. The NFL learned how to hide its brutality, how to polish it, rebrand it, and sell it back to us as triumph. It didn't grow gentler. It grew efficient. It learned how to turn human cost into national celebration. Because that's the paradox of football. It destroys the very men who make it great, and they keep showing up anyway. Not for money, not for fame, but for that moment when the crowd rises, the lights blind, and every wound, every sacrifice, every scar feels worth it. The league was built on that moment. It still is. And maybe that's why we'll never stop watching. Because somewhere in that chaos, we see something that feels like truth. Beautiful, violent, undeniable truth. Football didn't outgrow its brutality. It perfected it. And that is the brutal evolution of the NFL. If you want more stories of NFL greatness and heart, hit subscribe, drop a like, and stick around. The next chapter of football history is already waiting.